The fluorescent lights of Hansen's grocery in San Diego hum overhead like wounded insects, casting harsh shadows across Margaret Walsh's face as she stocks shelves in aisle 7. Her grey hair is pulled back tight, her hands moving with mechanical precision as she arranges boxes of cereal with the same attention to detail she once used arranging rescue coordinates on a tactical map. She wears a simple polo with the store logo stitched over the left breast, her scrubs abandoned 3 months ago when Seattle General became a memory she couldn't afford to revisit. The shirt is 2 sizes too large, on purpose. Invisibility, she learned long ago, is a tactical asset. A pair of worn combat boots sits in her locker in the break room. Her son's boots from Helmand Province. The only physical object she kept when the military erased her name from every record that mattered. She doesn't know why she brought them to this grocery store in a city where nobody knew her face. Maybe because some things are too heavy to leave behind, even when you're trying to disappear. Margaret has a slight limp in her left leg, a reminder from a convoy outside San Juan Valley in 2009. The limp is why she stocks shelves now instead of working the ER like she could. The limp is why she keeps her head down. The limp is why people don't ask questions. A tremor lives in her right hand too, but only when she's alone, only when the fluorescent lights cut out and the silence gets thick enough to suffocate in. She's learned to grip the shelf with her left hand when anyone's watching. Dr. Richard Caldwell manages this store. He had managed hospital administration once, at a facility in Portland, before an audit discovered that his billing codes were inflated by exactly 23%, the precision that suggested intent rather than accident. He'd left that job with a severance package and an NDA worth enough to stay quiet forever. Caldwell had no idea that Margaret Walsh had coordinated medevac operations under fire, that she'd pulled 37 operators from hot zones in Helmand Province, that her hands had held lives together when the world was screaming. He only knew that she stocked shelves slowly, avoided eye contact, and flinched slightly when he raised his voice. He watched her now from the aisle's far end, his polo starched to a knife edge, his name tag positioned exactly 1 centimeter below the seam of his shirt. A man who believed precision meant respect. A man who had no idea he was standing next to a legend. Margaret reached for the next box. The cereal aisle was nearly finished. 10 more boxes and she could move to the beverage cooler on the other side of the store, where the light was worse and people looked at you less. The store was quiet this morning, mostly empty except for a few regulars and the security camera that hung above the produce section like a mechanical eye that saw nothing and reported everything. The automatic doors hissed open at the front of the store. A young man in a wheelchair rolled through. Military bearing even in the chair, shoulders back, head level, the kind of posture that doesn't come from nowhere. He wore a faded Marine Corps t-shirt, the kind that gets soft enough to sleep in after multiple deployments. His left leg ended at the knee. His right leg was prosthetic, visible below his shorts, the articulation smooth as titanium. But what caught Margaret's attention, what made her pause for exactly 1/10 of a second while reaching for a box of cereal, was the pair of worn combat boots tied to the back of his wheelchair. Desert tan leather. Scuffed. Broken in. The kind of boots that have walked through dust that tastes like copper and smoke. She didn't look directly. That wasn't how you did this. You learned to see things in your peripheral vision, to catalog details without appearing to notice them. That was a rule she'd never forgotten. Dr. Caldwell stepped out from behind the customer service desk, his posture straightening as he moved into the store's main floor. He had been speaking to Mrs. Chen, who ran the deli counter, about why her shift wasn't starting early enough. Mrs. Chen had been standing with her hands at her sides, listening, while Caldwell gestured with short, precise movements, the kind of gestures that said listen carefully and don't argue back. Margaret had watched this interaction the way you watch a dangerous animal, with alert stillness. Now Caldwell's attention shifted toward the young Marine. His face arranged itself into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was the expression of a man who had suddenly noticed a problem that wasn't supposed to exist in his store. Margaret turned her focus back to the shelf. The box of Lucky Charms sat heavy in her hands. Her fingers were steady. This was the part that mattered, keeping your hand steady while everything inside you that remembers combat zones wants to move, wants to act, wants to pull people away from the things that will hurt them. Caldwell began moving toward her register. Register 3. The one Margaret had been assigned to that morning when she clocked in at 6:45 a.m., before the store officially opened. Her register. Her aisle. Her small piece of terrain in a grocery store in San Diego where nobody was supposed to know what she'd done or who she'd been. He stopped 2 feet away from her. Close enough that she could smell his cologne, something sharp and synthetic, like the inside of a car that had been baking in the sun. Close enough that she could hear his breathing, which was elevated, which told her something about adrenaline and confidence and the certainty that came from never having been challenged in a space he controlled. Walsh. His voice was measured. Controlled. The voice of a man who had practiced sounding authoritative in front of a mirror. We've had complaints. Margaret kept her hands on the shelf. The cereal box was still in her right hand. Her left hand gripped the edge of the display with enough pressure that the metal was cold against her palm. She didn't turn around. That was important. You don't give a predator eye contact unless you're about to fight, and she wasn't about to fight in aisle 7 of a grocery store on a Tuesday morning. Complaints about what, sir? Her voice was quiet. Deferential. The voice of someone who understood hierarchy and accepted it without question. The voice she'd perfected over 3 months of being invisible. Your demeanor. Caldwell moved closer. Your attitude. People don't feel comfortable in this store when you're watching them. Margaret placed the cereal box on the shelf. It aligned perfectly with the 3 boxes below it. She let her hand drop. I was just stocking shelves, she said. I'm aware of what you were doing. His tone had sharpened. The certainty of a man who was used to being right because nobody had ever told him he was wrong. Maybe you should find a role that's less customer-facing. I can find someone else to work Register 3. Someone who doesn't make people uncomfortable with whatever it is you're doing with your face. The words landed the way they were designed to land, like a blade that's been thrown without warning. Margaret felt them hit. She felt the impact. But her face didn't change. Her jaw didn't clench. Her hands didn't tremble. Her eyes didn't blink. This was training too, the kind that runs deeper than muscle memory. The kind that comes from surviving things that shouldn't have been survivable. She turned slowly to face him. Her eyes met his for exactly 1 second. That was all it took for him to see something in her gaze that made him step back. Not far. Just half a step. Just enough to tell her that some part of him, some lizard brain part that recognized apex predators, had registered what he was looking at. Then she looked away. I can work whatever position you need, sir. Caldwell's shoulders dropped. His certainty had returned. He'd interpreted her compliance as submission rather than calculation. He smiled, that small, precise smile again, and walked back toward the front desk, his shoes clicking against the tile floor with the rhythm of someone who owned the space he was walking through. Margaret stood motionless in aisle 7. The humming of the fluorescent light seemed louder now. The smell of the store, something like cardboard and plastic and the faint chemical tang of cleaning solution, filled her sinuses. She could hear her own breathing. She could feel the cold metal shelf beneath her palm. She didn't move for 12 seconds. Then the automatic doors hissed open again, and the young Marine in the wheelchair rolled deeper into the store, moving toward the cereal aisle where a woman in a polo shirt stood perfectly still, her hand steady as surgical steel, her eyes looking at boxes of breakfast cereal as though they contained the answer to a question nobody had asked yet. The cereal aisle stretched clean and ordered, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical hymn above rows of cardboard boxes arranged by brand and color. Tom Rivera reached for the frosted flakes on the top shelf, his right arm extended, the metal prosthetic below his knee catching the light as he shifted his weight in the wheelchair. His movements were precise, economical, the movements of someone who'd learned to calibrate every gesture, every pound of pressure, after learning what the alternative felt like. The worn combat boots tied to his chair's frame swung slightly with the motion, their leather creased and darkened by decades of wear that wasn't his own. The prosthetic detached with a sound like a rifle report. It clattered to the linoleum, followed immediately by the boots, still laced, still tied, tumbling after it in a cascade that echoed through the produce section 2 aisles away. The sound was the kind that made everyone look. An elderly woman with a shopping cart froze mid-step. A father pulling his daughter toward the checkout line turned, his expression shifting from neutral to something approaching pity. 3 customers who'd been comparing prices on granola bars fell silent, their eyes tracking downward like birds watching a wounded thing. Tom's face burned crimson as he bent forward in the wheelchair, reaching for the prosthetic that lay on the floor like a severed thing. His hands trembled, the trembling of shame, not pain. Margaret watched from her register 47 feet away, her hands continuing to scan items with the precision of someone whose muscle memory ran deeper than conscious thought. Scan. Item down. Next scan. Her jaw clenched once, then released, a movement so small only someone trained to read stress responses would have caught it. Her eyes were fixed on Tom's face, not on the prosthetic, tracking the exact moment when shame transformed into something harder. Something that looked like rage. Dr. Derek Caldwell appeared in the cereal aisle within 18 seconds. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd never been questioned by anyone who mattered, his white coat somehow immaculate despite the morning he'd spent, his face arranging itself into an expression of theatrical concern that didn't reach his eyes. His eyes held something else, something that looked like hunger. The crowd around Tom thickened, pulled by the magnetism of humiliation the way crowds are always drawn to it, rubbernecking at the emotional equivalent of a car accident. "We've had complaints about you making customers uncomfortable," Caldwell announced, his voice pitched to carry, to broadcast, to ensure that the pharmacy tech in the back and the deli manager would hear every word. His voice was like a tank idling in a garage, powerful, controlled, designed to intimidate through sheer presence. "This is a family store, Tom. Family. Do you understand what that means?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Maybe you should shop somewhere that caters to your situation. There are places. Special accommodations. No judgment. Just practical." The silence that followed was the kind you could operate in. Tom's hands stopped moving. He remained bent forward in that posture of vulnerability, one arm still extended toward the prosthetic, the other gripping his chair's wheel. Margaret saw the moment his shoulders tensed, the moment he made the choice between dignity and compliance, between speaking or staying silent. She'd seen that same choice on the faces of Marines in medevac helicopters, bleeding out on titanium stretchers, their eyes asking the question that bodies couldn't ask anymore. She'd seen it on her own face, once, a long time ago. Margaret's hands continued scanning. Tom retrieved his prosthetic. His hand shook as he reattached it, the mechanical socket settling into place with a soft click that nobody heard because Caldwell had begun speaking again, filling the silence with words designed to prevent Tom from filling it with his own. "Look, I appreciate you shopping here, I really do, but we have standards. Health code issues, accessibility concerns, liability. You understand? Nothing personal. I'm just trying to run a business. The other customers, they shouldn't have to feel uncomfortable because of." Caldwell gestured vaguely at the chair, at the prosthetic, at Tom's entire existence. "Because of circumstances beyond anyone's control." Margaret's hands paused, actually paused, the first break in her sequence in 47 seconds. Her eyes met Caldwell's across the store, and something in that contact made him smile. A smile like a wolf showing its teeth. A predator acknowledging a smaller predator in its territory. He nodded at her, a small gesture of solidarity, the universal signal of men in positions of power confirming to other men in positions of power that the world still belonged to them. Margaret's jaw clenched again. This time he saw it. "You got a problem, Walsh?" Caldwell called across the 3 aisles separating them, his voice dropping from its pitch-perfect announcement into something more intimate, more dangerous. "Or should I call you something else? I'm thinking of a nickname. How about the charity case? That's what you are, right?" Another bleeding heart higher from Corporate Sensitivity Initiative. He laughed. The sound was like gravel in a disposal. "Trying to save the world, one disabled veteran at a time." Margaret didn't respond. Her hands resumed scanning, each motion perfectly calibrated, perfectly professional. Her face was stone, a mask so complete that it revealed more than any expression could have revealed. In that moment, in that grocery store aisle with fluorescent lights humming their mechanical song and the smell of industrial-strength floor cleaner hanging in the recycled air, Margaret Walsh became invisible in a way that had nothing to do with absence. She became the kind of invisible that happens when someone refuses to perform the emotion you've scripted for them. The kind of invisible that infuriated people like Caldwell because it denied them the satisfaction of a visible wound. Caldwell's smile faded. That was the moment he decided he'd destroy her. Later that afternoon, Margaret stood in the break room arranging her lunch, a thermos of black coffee and a sandwich wrapped in aluminum foil, when Caldwell entered. He was holding a piece of paper, folded once, and there was something in his posture that suggested he'd been waiting for the break room to empty before making his move. Strategic. Measured. The behavior of a man who'd learned that sustained pressure broke more things than sudden force. "I'm placing a bet with myself about you, Walsh," he said, closing the break room door behind him. The sound of the latch was like a chamber closing. "I'm betting you quit within a week. Maximum 2 weeks. Someone with your employment history, gaps, more gaps, references I can't verify because you don't have them, no college degree, no certifications, nothing. You're holding on by your fingernails." He tossed her time card at her feet, letting it slide across the linoleum like a playing card. "Pick that up, sweetheart. That's your future right there." Margaret bent to retrieve it. Her hands didn't shake. The trembling wasn't fear, the trembling would have been fear. Instead, her hands were steady as surgical steel because her hands belonged to someone who'd held intestines back into abdomens in darkness, who'd inserted breathing tubes while bullets decorated the walls around her with patterns like abstract art, who'd kept people alive when keeping them alive required refusing to acknowledge that keeping them alive was even possible. Caldwell's bet was mathematics for people who'd never actually experienced consequences. She stood, time card in hand. "I'll be here," she said quietly, and there was something in that statement, something in the absolute flatness of it, the complete absence of defensiveness, that made Caldwell smile thin into something sharp. "We'll see," he said. At the customer service desk the next morning, Caldwell dumped a stack of forms in front of Margaret, complaint forms, at least 24 of them, printed on the store's standard beige paper with a logo at the top. "Fill these out. Document your existence. Justify your presence." The forms were dated across the past 3 weeks, though Margaret had only worked there for that long, which meant either Caldwell had been creating them retroactively or the previous shift managers had documented grievances that nobody had bothered to file until now. "Customers say you're unsettling," Caldwell explained, watching her face with the intensity of someone studying a microscope slide. "Something about your eyes. The way you look at them. They say it makes them uncomfortable. One customer wrote that you looked at her child like you were calculating something. Do you know what that sounds like to me, Margaret? That sounds like a liability." He paused, letting the silence expand. "Maybe you should work in the back. Stocking only. No customer interaction." Tom Rivera watched from the produce section, his wheelchair positioned by the Apple display where he'd been organizing the Fugees into pyramids. Margaret saw him seeing her. She saw the rage in his face competing with the shame, saw the moment when he recognized that she was being humiliated in real time for the simple crime of existing visibly in Caldwell's space. She saw, most importantly, that Tom understood she was being punished for witnessing his own humiliation, for failing to look away, for allowing her expression to remain honest when Caldwell had orchestrated an entire theater of cruelty. Margaret filled out every form. Her handwriting was perfect, precise, unhurried. At the bottom of each one, she wrote the date and her time code, and as she wrote, she photographed Caldwell's computer screen with the phone she kept in her pocket. The veteran's discount log. The spreadsheet he thought he'd hidden in a folder labeled Store Maintenance. The calculations showing how he pocketed the difference between stated discounts and actual ring-ups, roughly $487 per week in stolen military appreciation, a system that had been running for 8 months and would trigger an automatic audit if anyone with proper security clearance tried to process a discount code with the kind of military classification that Tom Rivera carried in his ID. Margaret had been trained to gather intelligence. She'd been trained to remain invisible. She'd been trained to understand that the most devastating victory was the one your enemy didn't see coming. Tom approached her register as she was finishing the afternoon shift, his wheelchair rolling silently across the linoleum. His voice was quiet, pitched low enough that Caldwell, monitoring from his office, couldn't hear over the ambient noise of the store. "You were military," Tom said. "Not a question." Margaret's hand stilled. She'd trained herself for invisibility, for anonymity, for the kind of existence where nobody asked questions and nobody received answers. But something in Tom's statement, something in the way he held that chair, the way his hands rested on the wheels, the particular shape his body made in space, told her that this young man had been trained too. He would recognize the tells. He would see through the mask. "I can tell," Tom continued. His eyes tracked her movements with the precision of someone reading threat assessment. "The way you move. The way you looked at Caldwell. Most people absorb that kind of humiliation. You were evaluating it. Like you were deciding something." Margaret's scanning hand tremored for exactly 2 seconds before steadying. 2 seconds was all she allowed herself. 2 seconds was the minimum required for honesty. "My commanding officer died in Helmand in 2009, Tom said, his voice dropping even lower. "Captain David Walsh. Convoy ambush in Sanjin Valley. They never recovered all the bodies." He let that statement sit in the space between them like a thing with weight. "I was 17, lied about my age to enlist. He saved my life twice before he died. He was like a father." The world compressed. The fluorescent light seemed to sharpen. The smell of the store, that mixture of floor cleaner and produce and the faint metallic scent of the meat counter, became overwhelming, became evidence, became time itself collapsing. Margaret's eyes glistened. Her voice, when she found it, remained steady. "He sounds like a good officer." "He was," Tom said. "He was the best officer I ever knew." Margaret resumed scanning his items. Her hands moved with the precision of someone whose muscle memory ran deeper than conscious thought. Around them, the store continued its ordinary transactions. Caldwell watched from his office, unaware that the moment unfolding in front of him was already calculating his destruction. Unaware that the woman at Register 3 was not simply a grocery store employee accepting his terms. Unaware that he was standing 2 meters away from someone whose call signs had been classified, whose service record had been sealed, whose very existence had been ordered into invisibility by people with the authority to make that order stick. The boots tied to Tom's wheelchair frame, the ones that had fallen in the cereal aisle, that had tumbled across linoleum in front of watching customers, those boots had belonged to a man named Captain David Walsh. A man who had been, before his convoy took fire in a place called Sanjin Valley in the year 2009, the commanding officer of the Master Chief Petty Officer currently scanning groceries under a false name in a store owned by a man committing federal fraud. Margaret placed Tom's items in a bag with the same careful precision she applied to everything, no rushing, no carelessness, every motion exactly as it needed to be. "Have a good evening," she said, and meant it with the totality of someone for whom having a good evening was a luxury she'd learned not to expect. Tom nodded and rolled toward the automatic doors. Margaret watched him go, watched the doors hiss open to release him into the San Diego evening, watched the moment when he disappeared into the parking lot and became, once again, simply a customer who'd passed through her register. She had no idea that her decision to remain visible, her refusal to flinch, her choice to photograph Caldwell's fraud, had just set in motion a series of events that would require 2 Black Hawks, 8 Marines in dress blues, and a brigadier general who would arrive in 48 hours to explain to Derek Caldwell exactly who he'd been humiliating. But Margaret would find out. Very soon, she would find out. 20 minutes after Derek Caldwell had finished his cruel performance in the cereal aisle, Tom Rivera was 3 rows over in produce when his hands started trembling. Not from fear, From the medication his VA doctor had prescribed 2 days ago, pain blockers that his body had never metabolized well in heat, and the grocery store's air conditioning had failed somewhere around noon. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric lullaby overhead. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His breathing came shallow, rationed, like he was back in the Humvee outside Sanjan Valley when the RPG hit and everything went white. He reached for a can of soup. His vision tilted. The can slipped from his fingers and rolled across the tile floor. Margaret was 4 aisles away, scanning a shipment of instant coffee when the first screams started. Not panic screams. Recognition screams. She looked up, and every cell in her body knew exactly what she was seeing: a man in a wheelchair, his head lolled back at an angle that meant loss of consciousness, his breathing the rapid, shallow gasps of someone whose heart was no longer maintaining perfusion. Chest pain presenting as heat exhaustion. She'd seen it twice in Helmand Province when medics didn't catch the medication interactions in time. Both men had died. Both had been her responsibility. She didn't hesitate. She moved. Derek appeared in her path like he'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Store policy," he said, his voice sharp with the satisfaction of a man who'd finally caught someone breaking a rule he could punish. "Only managers handle medical emergencies. Liability nightmare if you touch him. You'll get back to your register, or you're terminated on the spot. I'm calling 911 now." He pulled his phone from his pocket with deliberate slowness, moving like a man who knew he had all the time in the world because the rules were on his side and rules were all he'd ever needed. Around them, customers froze. Uncertainty hung in the air like humidity. Nobody moved to help. Nobody knew the store's first aid protocol. Nobody had the muscle memory of 18 years coordinating extraction operations under fire. Margaret's jaw clenched so hard she felt the muscle jump in her cheek. She stared at Derek for exactly 1 second, the pause of someone considering obedience, the pause of a nurse trapped in the machinery of corporate liability and manager authority. Then she made a decision that would shatter every careful year of invisibility she'd constructed. She moved past him like he wasn't there. Tom's wheelchair had begun to tip. His body was sliding forward, his breathing now the wet gasping of someone whose lungs were filling with the backup of a failing heart. Margaret dropped to her knees beside him, her scrub pants, the one she'd changed into after stocking, the ones that still smelled like cardboard and coffee grounds, pressing against the cold tile floor. She ripped open his shirt in one motion, her hands moving on their own, muscle memory taking over. 3 aisles down, a woman screamed again. Derek was shouting behind her, his voice cracking with something between rage and panic. "Walsh, I'm firing you. You hear me? Terminated. Liability issue, you're violating store protocol." She didn't hear him. Pain was information. Chest compressions required precision. She placed the heel of her hand on Tom's sternum, felt the recognition of bone beneath the skin, and began compressions with the rhythm of someone who'd done this in the back of a Black Hawk while rounds were hitting the fuselage. 1, 2, 3. Her arms were pistons. The compressions were hard enough that ribs cracked under her palms. Good, that meant depth, that meant perfusion, that meant his brain might not be dying. Customers scattered backward, creating space, their panic replacing their paralysis. A teenage employee in a green vest stood frozen, holding a price gun. Derek's face had gone purple. He was still shouting, but she moved through his noise like it was weather. "AED," Margaret barked at the girl. "Office. Now. Move." It wasn't a request. It was a command, and something in her voice cut through the retail environment so completely that the girl dropped the price gun and ran. Margaret didn't break rhythm. 30 compressions. 2 rescue breaths, checking his airway first, his mouth tasting of salt and fear. The monitor on her wrist, she'd kept it, all these years, old habits dying hard, showed her what she already knew. Rhythm was deteriorating. Oxygen saturation was catastrophic. Tom's pupils had blown, his skin going waxy pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Around them, more customers had gathered, forming a horrified semicircle. An older man pulled out his phone to record. Derek was on his phone too, screaming at 911 operators about liability and unauthorized medical personnel. The girl returned with the AED, this ancient box of a thing that looked like it hadn't been serviced since the store had opened. Margaret ripped it from her hands without acknowledgement, tore open Tom's shirt further, and pressed the electrode pads against his bare chest. The machine began its diagnostic hum, a sound like a computer from 1995, wheezing to life. The hiss of electricity. The voice on the speaker, staticky and distant, announced what Margaret's hands already knew. Shock advised. She pressed the button. Tom's body convulsed off the tile, his back arching, muscle responses that had nothing to do with consciousness. She resumed compressions immediately, counting under her breath, feeling the subtle shift in his chest wall as his ribs began cooperating with her compressions instead of resisting them. The store's automatic doors opened suddenly, bringing in a wall of San Diego heat and the sound of a siren screaming closer. Derek's voice had become almost incoherent behind her. "This is your last shift. I'm calling corporate. I'm calling legal. She's attacking this man. She's performing unauthorized medical procedures." But Derek's panic had shifted something in the watching crowd. The fear in his voice, the desperation, the way he couldn't answer a simple medical emergency except with threats and policy clauses, it had shown them something. It had shown them a man who understood only the rules of the store, not the rules of survival. A woman in a sundress stepped forward. "The woman knows what she's doing," she said quietly. "Shut up, Derek." Tom's breathing changed. The gasping became something with intention behind it. The monitor adjusted. Sinus rhythm. Margaret felt the shift like a prayer being answered, like a night vision scope suddenly focusing on a target that had been invisible. She kept her hand steady, kept the compressions even, kept her voice level as she looked toward the door and spoke to the paramedics she could hear but not yet see. 29-year-old male, probable medication interaction with heat stress, cardiac event at 21 minutes, AED applied at 18-minute mark, 1 cycle successful. Her voice had changed. The deferential tone of the stocking nurse had disappeared completely. What emerged was something else. Something that moved through the grocery store air like authority itself, direct, precise, competent. Sinus rhythm had returned. He was still alive. The paramedics burst through the automatic doors in their dark uniforms, the rotor wash of a responding helicopter starting to shake the windows in the distance. Someone had called for air support, and they took one look at Tom's chest, at the AED pads, at Margaret kneeling beside him with her hands positioned for another round of compressions, and something in their posture shifted. They didn't question her. They moved into the space she had created with the efficiency of people who recognized another professional. "Status?" the lead paramedic asked, and Margaret understood immediately that the question wasn't directed at Derek anymore, wasn't directed at store management or corporate policy. The question was directed at her. "Sinus rhythm established," Margaret said. 60 seconds. Vital stabilizing. Core temperature elevated. Medication interaction suspected. His chart should show recent VA prescriptions. She had given Derek exactly 40 seconds to prove he was anything other than a liability. He had spent all 40 seconds shouting about termination. The paramedics were already running an EKG, already getting oxygen flowing, already preparing for transport. Derek stood at the edge of the semicircle of customers, his face still purple, his power suddenly very small. The paramedics were already running an EKG, already getting oxygen flowing, already preparing for transport. Derek stood at the edge of the semicircle of customers, his face still purple, his power suddenly very small. Then he moved. Derek shoved through the crowd, his voice climbing to a scream. "You're fired. You're fired effective immediately, Walsh." He grabbed at her collar, his fingers finding the fabric of her polo shirt, the Hansen's grocery logo sewn just above her left breast. The name tag came free with a sharp ripping sound, plastic snapping against polyester, the sound of authority reasserting itself through pure spite. He held it in front of her face like evidence of a crime. You provided unauthorized medical care on store property. That's assault. That's practicing without a license. That's a lawsuit I'm not absorbing because some grocery stocker decided to be a hero. Margaret stood perfectly still. Her hands remained at her sides. She did not reach for the name tag. She did not speak. Do you understand me? Derek's voice had taken on the quality of a man rediscovering his own power after losing it for 30 seconds. The paramedics were sliding Tom onto a stretcher, stabilizing his cervical spine, checking the EKG readout that now showed steady rhythm. Margaret's compressions had worked, the heart responding like muscle remembering its training. But Derek was not looking at Tom. Derek was looking at Margaret, and his face was the color of raw beef. This is a liability nightmare, he continued, and now customers were filming on their phones, the fluorescent lights above casting everything in the color of fluorescent truth. You don't have medical credentials. You don't have authorization. You could have killed him. You could have, but he stopped, because the paramedics were finishing their assessment, because Tom was breathing normally now, because everyone in the store understood what had just happened. What Derek couldn't admit was that Margaret had just saved a man's life while he screamed about procedure. He walked away before anyone could see it in his face, the understanding that he'd just revealed himself as small in front of 200 witnesses. He walked to his office. The glass walls meant everyone could see him, could see his jaw working, could see him reaching for his phone. The first call came at 091 for hours. Margaret heard it from the break room, where she was collecting her belongings in a plastic bag, her name tag, a water bottle, a single framed photograph of someone else's life she'd kept hidden in her locker. Derek's voice carried through the thin walls, pitched for an audience, every word designed to land in the ears of the staff who were still watching. I need to report an assault. Derek's voice was controlled now, weaponized calm. Yes, an assault on a customer. My employee attacked a disabled veteran in the cereal aisle. I have multiple witnesses. No, she hasn't been detained, she's still on the premises. You'll want to send someone immediately. Hansen's Grocery on Mission Valley Drive. Margaret's hand paused on the photograph. She did not move. She did not react. The tremor that had started in her wrists during Tom's collapse began again now, a small mechanical quiver that felt like her nervous system was remembering how to be afraid. The second call came at 0916. I need you to block any workers' compensation claims from Margaret Walsh, effective immediately. Yes, the one who just assaulted a customer. I need a paper trail started yesterday. Liability waiver, independent contractor status, whatever you need to make sure she doesn't get a dime from Hansen's for a work-related injury. No, there won't be any documentation, I'm calling you first. I'll handle the paperwork. Just tell me what you need. Margaret placed the photograph face down in the bag. The person in it, a man in dress blues, dark hair, eyes that held too much knowledge of things that should never be known, didn't need to watch this. The third call came at 0918. Patricia, I need corporate to fabricate disciplinary complaints against Margaret Walsh. Yes, fabricate. Insubordination, erratic behavior, making customers uncomfortable, whatever sticks. Backdate them 2 months minimum. I need a paper trail that shows she was already a problem before today. You're HR, you know how this works. No, I don't care about protocol. I have witnesses to her assault. You handle the documentation, I'll handle the rest. He hung up. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that comes after someone has revealed exactly what they are willing to do to protect themselves. Margaret finished gathering her things. The combat boots, the worn ones with the vibram soles that had walked across deserts she'd never see again, that had belonged to someone whose name she could not say aloud in this place, went into the bag last. She held them for a moment, the leather familiar against her palms, scarred hands that had held too many things that couldn't be held. Then she folded them carefully, reverently, and placed them on top of the photograph. She did not cry. She did not tremble in public. She simply walked out of the break room, past Derek's office where he sat with his phone in his hand, past the checkout registers where customers were still filming their footage of a woman who'd saved a man's life and lost her job for it in the same breath. She walked past Tom, who was being loaded into the ambulance now, whose eyes were following her with an intensity that suggested he understood something that no one else did. She did not acknowledge any of it. That night, Margaret drove to El Cajun Boulevard. The diner was open, 24-hour establishments always are, existing in a kind of perpetual 3 a.m. even when it's still dark and the world has stopped moving. She ordered coffee she didn't drink. She sat in a booth that smelled like bleach and grease and the particular loneliness of very late nights, and she watched her own reflection in the window glass. The woman looking back was a ghost. Not transparent, Margaret had learned long ago how to remain solid, how to occupy space without being noticed, how to be present without being seen. But a ghost nonetheless. 14 years of invisibility had been the point. 14 years of disappearing after that operation in Helmand Province in 2009, after the testimony about contractor corruption that had gotten her buried so deep that even her own service record had been classified, compartmentalized, erased. The military had ordered her to vanish and she had complied. She had learned how to be invisible the way most people learn how to breathe. But invisibility had a cost. You became transparent not just to enemies, but to everyone. You became a woman who could save lives in grocery stores and lose her job before the ambulance left the parking lot. You became someone who had nothing, no credibility, no documentation, no proof of who you actually were. Just a grocery stocker named Margaret Walsh with a paper trail of false complaints and no witnesses except the 200 people filming on their phones who would never, in any meaningful way, matter. The coffee went cold. The diner stayed open. The city outside the window remained indifferent to whether she existed or not. She thought about Tom Rivera, about the way his eyes had found hers even as the paramedics were lifting him onto the stretcher. She thought about the combat boots that had belonged to someone whose name was still classified, who had died 3 hours after Margaret kept him alive for 14 minutes, whose memory was now tied to a young Marine veteran's wheelchair because that was the only way it could exist anymore, borrowed, unauthorized, squeezed into the margins of other people's stories. She thought about Derek Caldwell, about a man so small that he had needed to destroy someone just to feel large again. About how he'd made his calls with such precision, such tactical deliberation, so comfortable with lying that the Fosses had rolled out like scripture. He would succeed, she knew. The paper trail would be fabricated. The complaints would be documented. The assault allegation would evaporate once the police investigated, but the termination would stick. Hansen's would settle quietly. Derek would face no real consequences because he understood something fundamental about how power worked, that it wasn't about truth, it was about control, about narrative, about who had the authority to make the story stick. Margaret had lived long enough in the shadows to know better. She had lived long enough to understand that some silences couldn't be maintained forever. But not tonight. Tonight there was just cold coffee and a window reflection and the understanding that invisibility was finally, irreversibly over. Either she would find a way to step back into the light, or she would spend the rest of her life in this liminal space between worlds, not dead, not alive, just quietly disappearing a little more each day. At 03 for 7 hours, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. 3 days later. The morning manager meeting in Hansen's groceries glass-walled office overlooking the registers. Derek Caldwell stood at the whiteboard, mid-sentence about inventory controls, when the sound stopped him cold. Not the fluorescent hum of the store. Not the beep of scanners or the rumble of refrigeration units. A different sound. A deep, rhythmic percussion that made the windows vibrate in their frames. Helicopter rotors. 2 of them. Caldwell's face went pale. He pressed his hand against the glass as the first Black Hawk descended toward the parking lot, rotor wash scattering shopping carts like toys, sending a newspaper kiosk toppling. His district manager stood. His assistant stood. Nobody spoke. The rotors cut to idle. The second aircraft landed beside the first with a precision that made the building shudder. 8 Marines in dress blues emerged in perfect formation. Not National Guard. Not ceremonial. Their bearing was the kind that came from having cleared buildings under fire. They moved through the automatic doors of Hansen's grocery like they owned the ground beneath it, their dress shoes echoing on the tile floor in perfect synchronization, boots on tile, 1, 2, 3, 4, while every customer froze mid-transaction. Margaret stood at register 3, her polo shirt untucked slightly from the shift, her name tag still reading Margaret but nothing more. She watched them enter without turning her head. Her hands stayed exactly where they were, scanning items with the mechanical precision of someone who had already lost everything and found a strange peace in that emptiness. The lead Marine, a captain with a jawline that could cut glass, scanned the store until his eyes found Tom Rivera. Tom sat in his wheelchair near the cereal aisle, his father's combat boots, Captain David Walsh's boots, tied carefully to the chair's frame. The captain nodded. Tom's hands trembled as he reached for the wheels. Tom rolled forward. Every eye in Hansen's grocery tracked him. Customers abandoned their carts. The cashier at register 2 stopped mid-transaction. Derek Caldwell gripped the office railing so hard his knuckles went white, watching from his glass box like a man observing his own execution from a distance he thought was safe. Tom's voice came out strong, steady, the voice of a young Marine who had finally found the person who could answer the question that had haunted him for 14 years. Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. United States Naval Special Warfare Command. The store went dead silent. Margaret's hand stilled on the register. Her breathing didn't change. Her face showed nothing. But the Marines straightened fractionally, as if they had just been placed in the presence of something that required a different kind of attention. A brigadier general stepped forward. His uniform was immaculate. 3 stars on each shoulder. His voice carried through the produce section, through the aisles, through the frozen food section, stopping every conversation cold. Master Chief Walsh coordinated 14 high-risk rescue operations in Helmand Province. 37 lives extracted under direct fire. 3 Navy Crosses cannot be publicly displayed due to classified status. She was ordered to disappear for her own protection. Ordered to testify about contractor corruption. Ordered to vanish. The general's eyes found Caldwell in the office. You gave her a job stocking shelves. You called her incompetent. You fired her for saving a Marine's life. Caldwell's face was the color of raw meat now. He tried to move toward the door. The captain didn't even acknowledge him. The general continued, his voice dropping lower, which somehow made it more devastating. Your fraudulent veteran discount scheme has been under federal investigation for 6 weeks. You pocketed $47,000 from military families in 8 months. Master Chief Walsh's presence here was not coincidental. She was documenting you. The news cameras appeared in the parking lot 20 minutes later. They had been tipped off by an NCIS public information officer. The local stations arrived in time to capture Caldwell being escorted from the building by corporate executives and 2 federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with NCIS printed across the back. His protest started as words. They escalated to shouting. By the time they reached the parking lot, he was screaming about entrapment and military overreach and something about his constitutional rights, his voice cracking like a boy's. Margaret stood at register 3 the entire time, watching through the store windows as Derek Caldwell's career collapsed in real time, captured by 6 different camera angles. A customer approached her line. She scanned his groceries. Her hands were steady. Her voice was level. That'll be $32.43. The customer paid in silence, not meeting her eyes, suddenly aware he had just watched someone who looked like a middle-aged grocery store employee reveal herself to be exactly the kind of person you do not disrespect. The news story ran that evening. Caldwell's Seattle general billing fraud came out. His relocation to grocery management to avoid scrutiny came out. His district manager's decision to cover for him came out. Patricia from corporate HR was already cooperating with investigators, providing documentation of the fabricated disciplinary record she had been ordered to create. The lawyer friend stopped returning calls. The network Caldwell had cultivated for a decade evaporated in hours. 6 months later. Margaret stood in dress uniform at Camp Pendleton. Not the polo shirt. Not the stocking shells uniform. Navy dress blues with a line of medals across her chest, bronze star, silver star, 2 purple hearts, and finally, visible to the world for the first time, 3 Navy crosses. The cloth was faded from being stored in a sealed box for 14 years, but the weight of them was real. Tom Rivera's commissioning ceremony. He had completed officer training. Completed everything. Now he stood to receive his second lieutenant's bars, his dress blues crisp, his bearing perfect, his wheelchair polished to a shine that reflected the California sun like obsidian. He had requested Margaret present his bars. The commanding officer had approved it without hesitation. She stepped forward. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times, pinning the gold bars to his shoulders with movements that had been muscle memory for 3 decades. As she worked, Tom leaned close. His voice was barely audible, meant for her alone. He'd be proud. Your son. Margaret's hand stilled for exactly 1 second. Then she finished the task with absolute steadiness, but when she stepped back, tears were streaming down her face. Not trembling. Not breaking. Just tears running freely down the face of a woman who had finally stopped pretending to be invisible, and in that moment understood that the boy in the wheelchair was part of something larger, a continuation, a legacy, a connection that had been tied to a pair of worn combat boots all along. The boots were behind Tom now, displayed in a shadow box mounted on the wall of his quarters. Captain David Walsh's boots from Desert Storm, worn by his son in Helmand Province, now retired to rest beside a photograph of a young Marine and his commanding officer standing in front of a Chinook helicopter 14 years ago. And Derek Caldwell was selling supplemental insurance from a folding table outside a strip mall in suburban Seattle. His medical administration credentials revoked. His grocery management career terminated. Federal fraud charges pending. His network had scattered like smoke the moment the cameras arrived. Nobody calls anymore. Nobody returns his messages. The man who had thought himself untouchable had discovered what happens when you humiliate someone who has already lost everything and has nothing left to protect but the people who serve beneath her. Margaret returned to active duty as a special warfare instructor at Naval Special Warfare Command. She trained combat medics now. 20 of them in her current rotation, sitting at desks in a classroom at the Naval Amphibious Base in Coronado, California, watching her with absolute attention. One of them was a wheelchair-using Marine named Chen who had taken the same path Tom had taken. The others had scars they didn't talk about and skills they had learned in places most people would never understand. She stood in front of the class holding a photograph. Captain David Walsh in Helmand Province. His face young, focused, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She held the image up so everyone could see it clearly. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching, she said, her voice like a tank idling in a quiet garage, powerful and present and completely without pretense. It's not the medals. It's not the rank. It's the person next to you when everything is falling apart. It's the decision to help when nobody's filming. It's understanding that the person who looks like they don't matter might be the only thing keeping you alive. She lowered the photograph. Captain David Walsh saved my life. Not once. 14 times. Not because cameras were rolling. Not because anyone was watching. Because that's what warriors do. That's what you're going to do. The classroom was silent. Chen sat in the front row, notebook open, pen poised, watching the Master Chief with the intensity of someone taking notes on a master class in survival. And in that silence, with the photograph of Captain Walsh resting on the desk and the worn combat boots sitting retired in a shadow box somewhere across the base, Margaret Walsh, no longer invisible, no longer pretending, no longer carrying the weight of a secret that had hollowed her out, began teaching the next generation what it meant to survive. If this story hit you, if you understand what it means to be underestimated by someone who doesn't know what you're capable of, subscribe to this channel. Like this video. Comment below with a time you were judged by your appearance and proved everyone wrong. Because the quiet ones, the ones nobody notices, they're often the most dangerous. They're the ones who save lives when the cameras stop rolling.